Welcome to our Get Wise webinar. So I left Christian Science, now what? Today we're going to be talking about a kind of heavy topic. We're going to be talking about facing our grief. Growing up in Christian Science, we were taught that problems were illusions, the result of a false belief or a lack of faith. After leaving Christian Science, it can be challenging to acknowledge the suffering and wrongs we've experienced, much less know how to mourn them. We may even feel guilty for feeling sad about our past. Some of us face tragic deaths and illnesses due to radical reliance, but others of us may have wounds that are less visible, yet just as painful. Often we don't even know we're grieving because we're not connecting with our emotions. So today's webinar may stir up a lot of memories, and we encourage you to take a break if you feel yourself getting triggered. You can rejoin us anytime or watch the rest of the webinar on our YouTube channel. But facing our grief can really help us move forward rather than stay stuck in the past. And this is the goal of the Get Wise Project, specifically addressing the psychological damage from our background in Christian Science. And it's an arm of the Fellowship of Former Christian Scientists. And my name is Catherine Bimesha, and I'll be serving today as our moderator. And we're so excited to welcome Gina Roth, who's a spiritual abuse recovery counselor who will not only help us name our grief, but honor it and think about ways to regulate these strong emotions. Gina is just awesome, and she really understands the recovery process from Christian Science, and she serves as one of our Get Wise support group guest teachers. So I think you're going to really find what she has to share with us helpful. So thanks so much for being here, Gina.
I am Gina Roth, and I am a counselor in the St. Louis, Missouri area at Revision Christian Counseling. Just want to start with a little bit of background on who I am and why I'm teaching today. I have been a counselor here in St. Louis working with people coming out of spiritual abuse and trauma from churches especially. You can see there my family, 2 daughters, my husband, and our beagle mix, Moshi. And just in terms of professional experience, I've been a counselor, and I'm also a member of the International Cultic Studies Association. In terms of Christian Science, I am I am not coming from a Christian Science background, but I have been studying it and working with people from Christian Science for several years now, and have been part of your community. You guys have welcomed me in and taught me so much. And so now I'm going to kind of merge those things, what I've learned from you all and some of the things that I know from my professional background, into helping to lead this webinar today. In terms of my counseling style, I am attachment-based, and I work with EMDR and DBT for people who are coming out of religious trauma and abuse. Let's start with a roadmap for today's seminar. First of all, we're going to start with some trigger warnings and approach, and then we're going to head into 3 different parts. The first is grief background, or Grief 101, and then the second part is the role of grief after leaving Christian Science. Part 3 is practical ways to express grief. So we're going to kind of go through those 3 parts, and I'm just going to start with some trigger warnings for you today. First of all, some of the vocabulary I use, because I'm a non, I don't always realize when I'm stepping on a landmine in terms of vocabulary within Christian Science. A lot of these I've been able to catch, but just in case, I just want you to know that it's possible that there will be terminology used today that may trigger your past trauma and views held within Christian Science. And I would love, if you're willing and able to do this, to please ask questions, write notes, and follow up with me or Katie at any time. Please know that it's never my intent to promote Christian Science values, but rather to help you start to tease apart the meanings and share how particular terms are used within mainstream culture. So an example of that would be emotion regulation. When I say emotion regulation, I'm not saying don't feel. In fact, quite the opposite. But you might hear emotion regulation and think you're not supposed to feel, and that's not what I mean. So please know that sometimes I will be using terms that I know could be potentially confusing, but that I'm trying to minimize that as much as possible. Second trigger warning is on faith and religion background. So I want to own up front that I do come from a faith background, and I currently hold to a faith system, but this webinar is not an explicitly religious-based program. However, because Christian Science is a religious system, and it's considered by many people, including myself, to be a cult, We may at times mention the faith system in practical application to recovering spiritually. So just feel free to consider a more generalized higher power if you do not currently identify with a formal faith system. Also, it's really common to not engage in any religion or faith system for a long or short period after leaving a spiritually abusive one. So all those things are very, very possible. And I just want to create the space for you to be where you are today. Finally, my approach to this presentation, for the purpose of transparency, this presentation will assume three things. We assume that Christian Science is a cult, and you can see previous webinars by the Pardons and by me for more information on that. It is also traumatic to leave a cult. That's the second assumption that I'm coming from. And then third, trauma impacts the brain, and the brain can be rewired. So Christian Science is a cult, has a negative impact on a person psychologically, as well as relationally, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and so on. Because of the religious nature, this would also be classified as religious abuse, spiritual abuse, or systemic spiritual abuse. You kind of find the term that you feel the most comfortable with. All right, let's head into part 1, which is Grief 101. What is grief? We hear this word used a lot, but I'm just going to boil it down. Grief is a process of expressing and coming to terms with loss. It's a normal human response, and it also encompasses expression of complex feelings over time. Okay, so there's a couple things that are really important to that definition of grief. One, it's going to encompass a lot of different feelings. So grief in itself is not a single feeling. That's going to be significant because we're going to actually have to break grief apart into multiple different emotions. The other thing is that it occurs over time, right? So this is not a one-off emotion. It's not something that comes up and then goes away and is done. Typically, grief can take months or even years before you feel like you've come to terms with a loss. And it depends how big the loss is as well. Also, each person grieves differently. How you experience a particular loss will be different than how another person experiences. Even the same event can elicit two very different responses. And that's normal and to be expected, and something that may actually surprise you. There's not actually one set grief response. And that's part of what we're going to keep exploring today. Grief includes a range of emotions, anything from sadness to anger to even relief. Often the emotions we experience can feel shameful, which is a secondary emotion, when our grief looks different than what we expected. However, it's more important to understand what emotions are present with you at any given point and acknowledge what they are communicating to you about the loss. So in other words, it's helpful to avoid the shoulds. I should be crying right now. I should feel more upset. I shouldn't feel relief or excitement about this. Just to give you an example of that, I know a lot of times when we're dealing with a terminal illness for somebody, maybe somebody has cancer or has been ill for a very long time, there is a sense of relief that often comes when they do pass away. And so I guess I just want to validate and normalize that that's really normal to bring back into that space as well and say, hey, relief is actually okay here too. We just want to try to understand why it's there and what role it may be serving in that environment. Grieving requires a certain level of familiarity with emotions and what they're trying to communicate. So if you've been on any of my webinars before, you know that emotions, and especially this feeling wheel that you see there at the right, these are important things in my practice. So these come from a DBT basis, so dialectical behavior therapy, which really does help to do basic emotion education. A lot of times we don't learn those things in our environment growing up. And so just having a place to more formally learn some emotion content and expression is really helpful. So I also put in here, this is my chart on the roles of emotions, and I actually highlighted a couple that I have seen particularly within grief, but I would say also that I've seen most of these at some point or another. So again, this chart is set up just with the emotion and the role, how it motivates towards action. So for example, anger. We've talked about anger in depth, but anger exposes a real or perceived injustice. it also gives you energy toward correcting it. So anger is a very powerful emotion, and it comes from deep spaces within us. And so the more we are able to understand that anger is not the enemy, and actually let that anger be out, and actually try to find where it is exposing that real or perceived injustice, that's when we're going to be using our anger effectively. And then also it gives energy towards correcting it. It helps us to actually express that anger and complete that stress cycle within our body. Another one that I highlighted was sadness. This is one we often associate with grief. Maybe you imagine people sitting and crying over a graveyard or at a funeral service, but this does express loss of someone or something that's important to you. Or it can express the loss of a goal or a goal that's not attained. Expectations can bring sadness when they're not met. And really this is where we spend the time to work on understanding what things were actually lost. Another one I highlighted just to kind of give you an example of some of the confusing emotional presentation is jealousy. So jealousy communicates a threat to relationships or things that are important to us. So I've often seen jealousy present in grief when somebody is expressing a loss. Maybe they lost their parent, they lost their dad, and they're jealous of other people who still have that relationship with their dad or whose dad is still living. And so just to focus on this particular role and how it motivates, so it communicates that relationship is not what it was supposed to be, right? We're not made to be in broken relationships or in relationships that are not sustained, right? And whether that's death or a fight or something else that's separating us, often that can provoke that emotion of jealousy. And that just expresses that a relationship with my dad is something that I should have. I wish I had, right? And for whatever reason, that's no longer available to me. All right, let's keep going. What does grief do? Well, grief helps with a lot of things. It helps us incorporate new information into our narrative. It is process-oriented rather than product-oriented. Some grief experts say that we never really lose the thing that we are grieving, but our relationship with it moves from present and physical to past and representational. So for example, instead of me being able to interact with my dad, then all of a sudden I am interacting with my memories of my dad and what my connection with him was like when he was around. So if you can think of it like that, a lot of times that is helpful because you're shifting. You're not saying I'm getting rid of my dad completely, but rather that I am going to shift my relationship with him from one that I can experience and actually, hug him and connect with him to one that is representational. He was an important person in my life, and the things he taught me continue to impact me. Another thing is to consider the relationship and the attachment to the person, place, or thing that we've lost. For example, a relationship with a person who dies is not gone forever, but it's changed. Our memories with that person persist, and we can continue to think of their influence on us. So think of it as relearning how to connect with someone or something that is no longer available to you. It's no longer with you. So we have to change our relationship with that person or thing. I just want to talk about some traditional models of capturing the grief cycle. So the Kubler-Ross grief cycle lists out 5 traditional stages of grief. So you may be familiar with this. I'll just kind of run through these. At first, you're looking to gather information and communication, and then you're needing emotional support, and then eventually you're needing guidance and direction. But those 5 stages of grief are denial, where you may avoid or be confused. You may be in shock. You may be fearful of what happened, especially if that's sudden. That can be a really hard thing to sort of grasp. Anger, this frustration, anxiety, irritability, all of that can present in anger as you kind of work through those stages of grief. Depression, you might feel overwhelmed or helpless. You might just feel lost. You might feel sad and down a lot. Those those feelings of depression. This is also called sadness sometimes, but depression is how Kubler-Ross labeled that out originally. The fourth stage is bargaining. So this is when you are trying to find meaning. You are reaching out to others, you're telling the story, you are trying to create some sort of cohesion narratively. And then finally, levels of acceptance. So exploring options, getting a new plan in place, and finding meaning in the right now. Now, I will say this Kubler-Ross grief cycle is it looks very organized and put together. This is not typically what I see as a counselor in my room. Typically, grief does not present like this. So let me give you a couple of different options for how I prefer to think of grief. So the first one there is a tool listed under psychology tools, and just kind of the strength of emotions over time. And so it's just noticing that there are a lot of really close together ups and downs, and that's really normal. And so you're going to hit spikes, and then the goal is over time that those become less intense and more drawn out, more spaced out. The other one you see there is a tangled ball of emotions. So this is a common presentation as well of grief. And so each one of those little sections has its own particular emotion that you might be experiencing as part of grief. And so part of our job in counseling and part of our job when we're working with people who are in grief is to help them tease apart some of those things. Like getting I don't know if you've ever had a ball of yarn, an actual ball of yarn that has gotten tangled, and you're trying to sort through and pull those different pieces out. It's a lot of work, and it's very tedious sometimes. And sometimes you thought you had it, and then it will end up knotting in a different place. So that's another way that I like to think about grief. And then the one down at the bottom, this is one that I often show to my clients. I'll just draw it out on a piece of paper, because we've talked about how we think that this is a very linear, even a curve, but linear process, and it tends to be a little bit, a lot more messy. So I like to draw in all of those curly cues and sort of overlap them, and just to notice how hard it is for people to really capture what those first days, weeks, and even months of their grieving look like. Right? There's a lot that might feel lost. I like how how the circles go back over themselves. Even though time continues to progress, you feel like you're going backwards sometimes. So just kind of keep that in mind in terms of how grief might express itself as unpredictable, nonlinear, and complicated. So I do want to focus a little bit more on those components of grief. So I'm calling them components of grief rather than stages of grief or anything like that. So the first component that we're talking about is denial. It can be really hard at first to accept a loss, especially if the loss is sudden or unexpected. It can feel unreal at first. Denial is a really important component for that first year as you reimagine what birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries in a new context might look like. Denial is really common within grief. I can't believe he's not going to be here. I can't believe I'm not going to see them again. Okay. The second component is anger. We've talked about this before, but anger exposes real or perceived injustice. In grief, anger expresses that the loss has an unfair quality to it, and it's not the way it was supposed to be. Anger often looks like shaking your fists at God, so there's often a spiritual component to that anger as you try to understand the loss and the meaning and the purpose. And maybe you're even hitting some bigger existential questions like, why does this happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? Where was God? Different things like that can be expressed through anger. Another component is sadness. Sadness expresses the loss of something important. Sadness is often expressed through crying and may come and go throughout grief. You also might hit points where you're sad but can't cry any longer. But the low mood of sadness slows us down, and it provides the time and space to actually feel that loss within your own body. The fourth component we're going to talk about is bargaining. Since the emotions of grief are often unpleasant, it's a normal human response to try to make them go away. bargaining is one way that we try to do that. Bargaining can look like problem solving to lessen the pain, or trying to rewrite events so that they don't happen that same way ever again. Eventually, we hope to get to that fifth component, which is acceptance. Eventually, we will incorporate that loss into our lived experience. We learn how to tell that story cohesively. We learn how to take one step at a time and move forward. That first year is often the hardest, as there are many reminders of the loss. And you might also experience acceptance and then non-acceptance and then back to acceptance. So again, we're going to spiral through these stages or these components. It's not going to be very simple and straightforward. Another thing I'd like to talk about is veiled grief. So you might be grieving and not know it. So as we discuss components of grief, you may also be able to understand where you're grieving by starting with the emotions. So if you're not sure what you're grieving or why, you might just think you're angry all the time, but maybe there's a grief fueling that anger. So the anger persists because we have never gotten to the root of the loss that we experienced. So just to address this, and we'll get to this a lot later too, is to practice mindfulness and curiosity as you explore what might be a veiled grief or grief disguised as something else. And then complicated grief. So persistent complex bereavement disorder is listed under the other specified trauma and stressor-related disorders in the DSM-5. That's an actual diagnosis that may apply to you, and it's characterized by severe and persistent grief and mourning reactions. Now, it's kind of hard to tell what is complicated grief and what is just grief that's taking a long time. It's really hard to know how much time is appropriate or how much intensity is appropriate. This condition doesn't mean that grief after a loved one is lost is unusual or that it's always clinical. Still, it may be helpful to talk with a professional to evaluate your grief response. And if you feel like you may qualify for this diagnosis, please see a mental health professional or a medical professional so they can help you evaluate, diagnose, and then treat you. All right, let's head into the second part, which is the role of grief after Christian Science. I listed out this quote, CSers don't grieve. There are no problems and no death. People just disappear, and we are taught to just move on. This has been something I've heard from Christian Science members, former Christian Science members, a lot. We don't deal with things that are real, and so grief is one of those things. We don't deal with loss either. What are you grieving after leaving Christian Science? Could be many different things. I've tried to list out a few of those things. Deaths that have gone unprocessed. Maybe your entire life. Maybe you've lost people and they just disappeared and you don't know where they went or what happened. Losses of family and friends still in Christian Science. Loss of knowledge of the physical world. You didn't learn things growing up in school the way many of your peers did. Insecure attachment and loss of connection with parents and caregivers. You might be grieving having to relearn all of the things. You might be grieving the betrayal, the distortion, being lied to. You might be grieving that grief was shut down. You might also be grieving that relationships aren't what you want them to be. You might be grieving mental and physical health issues. Sometimes those even persist from childhood, such as if you had a broken bone that was not set right, or you had an illness that was not treated early and now is causing lasting impact on your body. Those are all things that we might need to grieve in addition to unmet expectations, right? Maybe you have expectations about what your journey should look like now. But I'd urge you to just take a minute or two to consider how you've experienced loss, or maybe just jot down the question and spend some time with it later. But how have you personally experienced loss after leaving Christian Science? I'd like to introduce to you a helpful metaphor for you. So this book is Tear Soup, and it is one of my absolute favorite books. I love this book for grief, but I also love it because it helps to normalize and give us language to talk about loss. So you can see there's a summary. This book is by Pat Schwiebert and Chuck DeClyon. I hope I'm saying those right. And it has beautiful illustrations by Taylor Bills. It's published in 2005 by Grief Watch, and the story is of a grandmother teaching her grandchild to make soup following a loss. And the idea is that Tear Soup is this kind of product of our grieving, and it's written as a children's book. It has beautiful illustrations, absolutely gorgeous illustrations, and there are a lot of grief resources listed at the end as well. But this is not just a children's book. I can say that when I read this book and I'm considering a loss that I've been through, I almost always am crying reading this book. So a little note of caution, it's not one that you're going to be able to give to the kids and not engage with yourself. Like, it really is a pretty deep and thoughtful book. Let's talk about a couple of my favorite pages. So this page is probably my absolute favorite. I have it marked in my book. I have a spare copy of Tear Soup that I lend out to clients. My favorite page is this one where it talks about cookbooks and pot sizes. So here the metaphor includes the many things that we might need to grieve. So you can see in those cookbooks things like fatal diagnosis, divorce, death, near death, fire, loss of status, etc., and so on. So it also labels those pots from not fair or getting bad news to a major tragedy or more than I can bear. So this approach normalizes grief as a part of our daily life. So maybe we're not constantly grieving a major tragedy or more than I can bear, but we all have little losses, things that we feel are not fair, but getting bad news, things not going the way we want them to. So I really love that it normalizes that process and helps keep it from feeling like a bad or negative process in any way. A couple of the major themes that I love to pull out are about the grieving process itself. It talks about the importance of time and how we have to cook this soup slowly. It talks about patience and thoughtfulness and how we have to be patient with ourselves. It explores how other people can help or harm the person grieving by what they say and do. And by highlighting the importance of safe people, support groups, and spiritual resources, it also acknowledges that we need community and support to cope well with loss. As a caregiver, as somebody who has worked with a lot of people in loss, I've learned things from this book in terms of how to care well for those who are hurting. It also touches on the fact that different people may process the same event differently. For example, she's the grandmother is telling the story. She's kind of the narrator, but it also talks about how the grandfather is grieving differently and separately, and that each person has their own process and that's okay. Anyway, I highly recommend this book. I think it's fabulous and delightful, and like I said, it's just a beautiful book to read and to look at. So I'd encourage you to pick up a copy and read through it. All right, and then finally in this section, let's talk about what you personally might need to grieve after leaving Christian Science. What cookbooks will you use? What pot sizes will you need? Who is a part of your support system as you grieve? In what ways do you face grief? In what ways do you avoid grief? We could add to that, what ways do you speed along the process, and what ways do you give it the time it needs? How will you cook your tear soup? All right, let's head into part 3, which is practical ways to grieve. In addition to buying the book Tear Soup and reading through that is always one of my top ways that we can use these resources well, and it's a very practical way. But there are other ways that we can think about grieving. The first step, especially for somebody coming out of Christian Science, is to acknowledge that something is wrong. That might seem overly simple, but the first step is actually to notice and name the loss. Notice that there is loss and that your first instinct is to avoid it. That is what you have been taught. You've been taught to avoid it, and you've practiced that for so many years. The second step is to acknowledge that you are not okay. You aren't okay. It isn't fine, and it's not all good. Start there and let your anger fuel your desire to further investigate using the bottom-up process that I'm going to outline here in a bit. All right, so when we talk about your experience of grief, we're going to first start with the bottom part. So that bottom part is what I'm talking about, is that bottom part in your brain. So I'm labeling 3 different layers of the brain. The cortex is on the outside, limbic system, where your emotions are, is in the middle, and then your core or your hind brain, sometimes called your reptilian brain, that is in the deepest part, or the sort of the bottom of your brain. So we're going to coordinate that with how we're experiencing those things in our body, or the hind brain, in our emotions in the limbic system, and then in our thoughts and logical understanding, which is in that cortex. So let's start with the body. Let's identify your physical experience of grief. What does grief feel like in your body? Where do you notice it? Do you feel it in your chest as tightness or pain? Or maybe you feel it as a lump in your throat. Do you notice your temperature rising or your breathing speeding up? Do you notice feeling a heaviness or a weight on your shoulders? These are just some of the many ways you might physically experience grief. Just notice those things and take note, maybe journal those out or walk through those just by noticing. So I mentioned the 3 different layers of our brain. We know from a trauma-informed practice that we can first soothe and regulate the brainstem and midbrain. So what that requires is for us to cool down your brain. So regulate, or calming the body, we're first going to deal with that bottom section, right? That hind brain where you're having autonomic nervous system triggers come up. So we're going to calm the body. Find which things help you slow your body and calm the base brain. This might be taking slower breaths, might be using a cold pack. It might be activating the dive response, which is something you can look up if you're interested in that. It involves cold water and leaning your head forward as if you're diving. It might involve stretching or punching a bag, somehow to get that extra energy out. The second stage is relate, so connecting through attuned, sensitive relationships. Empathy and validation help us to feel seen, heard, and understood. And then finally, we get to that cortex part of our brain where we can reach in and do that thinking. Okay, so that's where we do all the thinking we think we're thinking, which gets complicated, but it's actually just the last part that is able to engage. So using this bottom-up approach works with your brain instead of against it, and we can't reason when we're dysregulated and disconnected from others. So you're going to be much more effective in your grieving process if you follow this bottom-up plan. Mindfulness. I feel like I talk about this with every webinar I give, but that's just because I think it is so important. So understanding grief centers on our ability to know what is happening, where in your body, why it's coming up, and what you want to do with it. It's so important to hone that mindfulness skill and be comfortable understanding your own body signals. Once you've attuned with your body, try to name the emotion or component of grief you're experiencing. Is it sadness, anger, confusion, overwhelmed? I'd encourage you to be an emotion detective. Don't stop until you understand it. Learn to be comfortable sitting with the emotion and don't rush past it or push it down. Instead, we want to explore it and actually let it have some space. So by exploring the different aspects of grief with curiosity and self-acceptance, we're actually helping our brain to process through those things even more effectively. And then from there, we can name the loss itself. Can you articulate what you are missing and how it is impacting you? It makes a lot of sense to grieve after leaving Christian Science. Mindfulness includes truth-telling to yourself. I also know I've said this before, but Dr. Dan Siegel coined the phrase, name it to tame it. It is opposite from what you learned in Christian Science. David Rock also states that you could reduce stress by up to 50% just by noticing and naming your state. Isn't that incredible? These things that you were taught to not name, that if you name it, you actually give it power. We're actually doing the opposite. We're naming it to take away the power. And that comes from brain science and all the hard work that these great thinkers have done in the field of psychology and counseling. All right, and my next encouragement is just to give yourself time. The fastest way to resolve the discomfort that comes with grief is to sit with it, learn from it, and let it resolve on its own. So while time might not heal all wounds, in grief, it does create space. so we can see all of the parts that are there and honor them and really process through them. It takes how long it takes, which might be months or years. Try to withhold judgment on yourself in the process, and just know that that first year after loss is often the most difficult. You will cycle through all of the seasons and the holidays and imagine life without the person or thing that you lost. So it does get a little complicated when we're talking about losing a person versus maybe grieving a thing or an expectation, or not having a close relationship with a parent. So I just want to acknowledge that is sometimes very different, and I'm kind of talking about it in terms of the loss of a person, but it really does apply to other losses as well. And you might find that it doesn't take as long with different losses, or it takes longer with certain losses. All of that is normal. There is really no set timeline for grief. You can see there I have a stopwatch. Please don't use a stopwatch when you're grieving. It will never be helpful. You don't need to do that. A calendar is maybe more appropriate. Maybe by the next January I might be feeling something different, and just check in on that process. A couple of the other practical things I would encourage are, one, understand about grief and loss, and two, find ways to memorialize the loss. So journaling is particularly effective because if you ever go back and read any of your journal entries, you'll notice that growth. You'll notice that change from point A to point B, and you'll be able to appreciate that this has been happening slowly, and yet it's happening, right? So that's actually a really encouraging thing for us when we're going through grief or loss, is to be able to track how that has looked over time. So I'd encourage you to journal. If you're not a traditional journaler or don't like to write things down, there are creative ways to do that. You can do an art journal or an audio journal. So I have people who will just record into their phone, and they will kind of spout off kind of where they're at right now, and just make sure you date those things so that you know when you did that, and kind of what was happening that maybe was triggering you into expressing it in that moment. Visiting special places. So when you have, and this for the death of a person that's close to you, this might include the cemetery or graveyard or memorial site or memorial plaque, if you have one, or it could be a special tree, or it could be a place where you vacationed together, or a place that you remember spending a lot of time together. Visiting those special places gives us time and space to start sharing memories, right? So the more we sit in those places, we're reminded of smells and sounds and different things that remind us of that loved one, or the thing that we've lost. And then sharing memories. So when we've lost a person, sharing memories about that person help to create a complete, complex picture of who that person is or was and how they have impacted you. Also, it's important to memorialize a loss. Maybe it's through an object or a place. Maybe you have a special meal in their honor. Maybe you still buy them a birthday cake, right? And enjoy their favorite kind of cake at their birthday or something like that. Really, the sky is the limit in terms of how we can grieve. There are so many different options and so many different ways that we can honor the loss and move forward in that loss with a complete sense of our whole brain is present while we're there, thinking about thoughts and feelings and body sensations all at once. A lot of times those memorials are really helpful for that. And then finally, complicated grief and bereavement. I just want to touch back to this, but if you do find yourself getting stuck in the grieving process, maybe you've started to name those things, but the feelings are overwhelming, there are professionals who can help. You can look for a counselor who specializes in grief and loss to walk with you through it. A lot of counselors can do this even if they don't specialize in this. It's just sort of slowing things down. But the point is that you don't have to do this alone. Okay. Consider finding a counselor who can help walk through it with you. All the losses from Christian Science, not just people who have passed away, but all of those losses that we talked about earlier. It's also important to figure out whether your grief is normal or complicated, and these professionals can help you get through it. They can help provide resources and different different opportunities for you to work through that grief in real time and in real life. One last reminder for you today: grief is not bad. It is a normal part of life, and the emotions within grief help us to adapt to those losses that we experience. So by accepting yourself and this grief process, you are more likely to not get stuck in complicated grief. Grief and lament are process-oriented, not product-oriented. So the more aware you can be of yourself in it, the better. Thank you so much for being here and for joining for this webinar. I am going to be around to answer some more questions. If you've had any come up, I hope that you've been putting them into the chat. If not, jot them in right now, and Katie will help facilitate that time. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. This is so great. Wow, really, really heavy and really helpful. I appreciate just yeah, your encouragement in just giving some practical ways of starting this process. But also, I mean, I think unpacking this, you start realizing just how important it is to do this work, and at least for me, how much more there is to do in that grieving process. So, yeah, thank you so much, Gina. This is really helpful. Yeah. Well, I hope we're going to have some Q&A now, so feel free for participants just to write questions in our chat or in the Q&A, which is ever most helpful for you. And one question, Gina, just to start off with, I think there's often a lot of dissonance. People coming out of Christian Science have a lot of dissonance where um, we often have a lot of happy memories. We even may have thought we had kind of a utopian sort of everything was perfect childhood. And then as we're recovering and looking back, we start realizing some of the destructive patterns and the dysfunction. It was just under the surface. Um, so maybe we didn't have a radical reliance death in our family or a major illness, but there's a lot under the surface. So how would you suggest someone deal with that kind of cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, that's a great question. Cognitive dissonance comes up a lot in grief. We'll just have a very, or ambivalence is what we tend to call it in the counseling
Yeah.
world, having those two opposite feelings at the same time. And just having that mix is it's a challenge with grief, right? Because you're dealing with things that don't normally go together, right? Some relief and sadness, or anger and frustration, along with happy memories, right? And so I think that's where I would say let's not throw either out, right? And so can we create space for both things to exist at once? So for example, like maybe we hold space and we let those positive feelings come out too, right? Like I generally was happy, right? Like there were things that went well in Christian Science. Maybe you felt like you connected well with your parents, or you had different things that you did enjoy, different good memories. That doesn't make those memories bad. It just adds to it layers of complexity. And I think that's where grief can be really challenging, because we're holding a lot of things at once, and that can be really complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and I think that is one of the questions people are, starting to think about and ask is, sometimes it's very concrete where you're losing someone, and many people coming out of CS have that experience where you've lost someone. But some of us, well, all of us coming out of CS are also losing a religion, a faith, and that affects every part of our life, and it can be kind of loss upon loss, um, and especially as you're unpacking it, there can be kind of a death upon death, not of a person, but of this, of I guess what we believed, our faith system. Um, do you have any suggestions for that? The difference between losing a person, losing a destructive faith system.
Yeah, and that is one thing that it makes it really helpful if we can make it concrete somehow. So I talked about like journaling or writing down. Art journals are especially helpful with something like this because you can capture something, whether through music or art or pictures or some sort of representation of what you've lost. Um, yeah, and it just helps to bring a sense of concreteness to that loss. And I think that can be really helpful for us just as we try to capture what that loss has meant. So somehow memorializing it and naming those things out. I go back to that name it to tame it sort of idea. Like the more I'm able to put words to what this loss is, what that means to me, what expectations were broken, what things did I not know that I should have known. um, like the more we can put words to those things, the more we're able to, I think, capture what we're sitting in front of. Like, what are we sitting with when we're sitting with this grief? What are we creating space for? And when we could do that, we're actually inviting this sort of nebulous idea, this concept, this leaving a religious system. Like we're putting that into words. Maybe Christian Science was your stability, it was your structure, it was your sense of rules, it was your sense of order, right? And when we leave something, we typically need to find something else to replace that, right? Maybe not right away, but if their spouse dies, we don't remarry right away, but maybe in time we come to that space where we can find a new relationship. Maybe the same is true with faith. Like as you start to unpack and sort of take some of those aspects off of your faith or your expectations of faith, maybe then eventually you're able to somehow engage in some sort of spirituality or some sort of connection with a higher power. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think just to give that time, right? It takes time.
And maybe that kind of helps with this not being overwhelmed, because I think sometimes people don't face their grief or can feel just like the grief will be unending because we're trying to look at the whole ball, like that graph you showed with the with
Mm-hmm.
all of the pieces. And so maybe unpacking that and kind of focusing on one aspect at a time will make it a little bit less overwhelming, and maybe just
Yeah.
grieving that medical piece or grieving um, you know, kind of naming different pieces of our story, and
Exactly.
just that's kind of
Yeah,
what you're
absolutely.
saying.
Pull one
Yeah,
piece at a time, right? You don't have to do the
yeah,
whole thing all at once. I think about it like we usually have a puzzle going on at my house. And so like if you do 1,000-piece puzzle, you don't do it all in one sitting, right? You're not typically going to sit down and do hours and hours and hours of this one puzzle at the same time. You're going to maybe focus on the outline first, right? Or separating
mm,
out different colors, right? And so I think just taking each of those steps as an entire task can be a helpful way to think about it. Like you don't have to pull apart the entire ball of yarn in one sitting. You don't have to tease apart every emotion within grief. Give yourself that time and space. Let it sit on the table, so to speak, for a while, for a week or two, or over Christmas break if you're the kind who likes to have a puzzle over the holidays. And just come by and put a piece or two in here and there when you feel up for it, right?
yeah.
It doesn't have to be a chore. It can be something that is actually a delightful process, like as you're starting to remember and honor something that you've lost.
Mm,
But yeah, I'd encourage you to kind of come and go and give yourself that time and space between without biting off too much that you can't chew it.
yeah. And I think again that kind of bumps against our
Yeah.
CS tendencies to want everything to be perfect
Mm-hmm.
now and to have everything be instantaneous.
Yeah.
And so I think that sounds difficult, what you're talking about, Gina. And yet, on the other hand, maybe that's kind of part of the becoming human piece, part of
Mm-hmm.
actually honoring just that process, just realizing that it's going to be a process.
Mm-hmm. And maybe even just naming that a good version of grief is that it does take a long time. It changes that definition of perfect, right?
Mm,
So like we still can strive for excellence. We can still strive to grieve well, but there's no one right way, right? It's going to take time, it's going to take space, and that's okay. Like we actually want it to take time and space because that helps us be really thorough in understanding how what we're doing and where we're coming from and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, one person talks about just kind of they're naming the grief. You need to adjust to a whole new way of looking at the world. Almost 40 years and still dealing with the shock of how I was raised and what I saw as normal going away. Um, and that's a big piece of it. There's kind of a death of what was normal and
Mm-hmm.
kind of a betrayal even
Mm-hmm.
with that.
Yeah, and
Um,
reorienting to a whole new world, right?
right?
That's a
Hmm.
lot.
That is a
Like that
lot.
in itself, I feel the exhaustion of what an undertaking that is.
Yeah,
Um, and you said 40 years. I mean,
yeah,
that seems to fit that kind of a loss. Like your whole world was taken
yeah.
from you. Your whole world was turned
Mm-hmm.
upside down. Of course, it's going
Mm-hmm.
to take decades, right? And yet, I'm sure there are some things, some parts of that, that don't feel like they've gone on for that entire 40 years. So, if there are ways that we can take off chunks of those tasks and not have to think of like, I have to grieve CS as a whole, but rather I'm grieving this loss within Christian Science. I'm grieving this loss within Christian Science. That might be helpful instead of the discouragement that I think could come if you're thinking of I've left in that 40 years, right? That can feel really overwhelming. So I'd really encourage, I think in that case, I'd really encourage to break that down into much smaller pieces, and to celebrate when you have come through something with 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 grace and success and this kindness that, like this relief, this acceptance that you've gotten to with certain aspects, even if it's not with all of them.
Yeah, yeah. And that's someone asked, what are ways we as XCS specifically face grieving? Um, Kind of, I guess it's kind of like what might be helpful for us to be, what's that process like?
Mhm.
Maybe just unpack that a little
Yeah.
bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I'd encourage you to go back and maybe screenshot that part in the presentation where I kind of listed out some of the losses within Christian Science. I think if you can separate it out and pull out these different pieces, I'm sure you have more, right? That was just
Hmm.
like off the top of my head things that you might grieve coming out of Christian Science. But if you can like take a screenshot of that, copy them out, add to them, right? And make a more an even more complete list for you and what that looks like for you, I think that could be a really helpful tool for understanding just how big the loss is after
Yeah.
leaving a cult like Christian Science.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's a lot there. There's a lot of different components and a lot of different things that in and of themselves might take years and years and years.
Right. Even just, and I think that you did a good job of talking about just acknowledging grief, that we have things to grieve, is really the first step, right?
Yeah.
For many of us, it's taken us a while to say that Christian Science is a destructive group, or to
Mm-hmm.
say they're, that someone died most likely because of radical reliance, or Christian Science impacted some of the
Mm-hmm.
ways we've some of the ways we've been hurt or have suffered. It's been because of that worldview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so just even thinking, just physically, relationally, emotionally, going through those pieces, and I think that idea of taking piece by piece rather than trying to do it all at once, and be done with it is really important, because I think it is easy to get overwhelmed
Mm-hmm.
if we try to do too much at once. Um, Someone asks here, so we can grieve the loss of who we could have been. That's a good
Mm.
question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes sometimes I replay memories and wonder how I would have handled them without CS.
Mm.
I don't know if this is productive or helpful.
That's a great comment, and just kind of that different perspective. Sometimes it can be helpful. Sometimes it can get us stuck in a loop, right? So I think that would be where, if you're not sure of on a specific like that, I would maybe talk with a friend or talk with a professional, talk with somebody who you trust to be able to give you some feedback. Like, does it feel like I'm stuck here? Or am I just finally putting some space in into this discussion to actually spend time with something I wouldn't have spent time with before? And I'm not going to know that for you. And I wish I did. Um, just to help with that, because I think it can be a really confusing place to be. But I also know that part of what you're reorienting is your sense of self, right? And your ability to trust your own self, your own gut in what is happening. And so, yes, the part you said at the beginning, Katie, that you could, what was it that you could
So we
grieve
can
what
grieve the loss of who we could have been.
who we could have been. Oh gosh, that is just so profound. Like, just even that wording of who we could have been. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's absolutely true. What would it have been like to have grown up in a different faith system, or without those kind of underlying values that push feelings aside, right? What would that have
Mhm.
looked like? I'm not saying that we stand there forever, right? Because we still have a practical in the now, um, but yeah, to consider some of those things that can be part of it.
Yeah.
Um,
I thought it was really interesting when you talked about jealousy,
hmm,
because I think that's an emotion that I hadn't really associated with grief, and yet it's something that I've experienced or have heard in other ex-CSers, where there's just kind of and I wouldn't have categorized it as jealousy, but kind of a
hmm,
longing, like I wish I had had,
hmm,
you know, that sort of medical care, or
hmm,
this kind of spiritual experience from the beginning. Um, and just kind of that longing, and maybe I mean, would that be jealousy,
in
or
some
this sort of,
ways.
yeah, this kind of
Yeah.
open relationship to talk about my problems with my friends or things
Yeah.
like that, or that's hard for me now, and so that
Yeah.
feeling that loss, so I'm kind of grieving what wasn't rather
Mhm.
than
Right.
grieving something I had and then lost, which is
Right.
is a different sort of grief.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like how you put that too with it's the absence, not the presence of a loss, right? Like, I don't know, there's something really, really neat in what you just said. Um, and I think also just being able to capture that there are some losses that are easy to name, and then there are some or losses or feelings within grief that are easy to name, and then there are some losses that, like, is it this or is it this, right? Like, as we kind of tease those things apart, and it might be that blending. I don't know if you've seen the movie Inside Out, but I
Yeah.
love that the parts where they talk about those those integrations of two different emotions, and how that's complex feeling level. And so, like, and it's possible that, coming out of Christian Science, that feels like way too far ahead, when you feel like maybe just trying to grab some of those like basic emotions. But like, as you keep at it, like, those things do grow, and your ability to see those two different sides to the same event, two different emotions to the same event, I think those become more possible, and I think it becomes easier to see, honestly, just with time and experience. And so, being able to say, okay, well, within Christian Science, like, I didn't have this, normal faith system type of experience, but I did have coping mechanisms for getting through really hard stuff. I just pretended it wasn't there. Right. So there could even be like a celebration in that. And it's like, when we have to go back and re-grieve or grieve more on some of those things, then it's like, oh, now I feel the sadness. I feel the loss. That's overwhelming. How do people get through that? Right. And so, just kind of the disbelief that other people are holding that kind of loss regularly. Yeah. So I think just understanding that there's complexity to it. Like, there's give and take, there's ups and downs, there's a lot of nuance to it also.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Another question here says, one of the hardest things is that no one I encounter can understand the differences between CS and regular Christianity, and that is
Mm,
often something that we face. I mean, there can even be grief to that people really don't understand, what's been so painful in our lives. Um, right, I explain a little, and after their jaw drops, which can be hard sometimes too, the room becomes silent or the conversation changes quickly. Um, and that can be hard, right? When we're grieving, just how people, there's one thing for us to be dealing just within ourselves, but if we're grieving, how are people supporting us around?
Mm-hmm.
How are the people around us supporting us or not supporting us?
And
They
that's
continue,
especially hard if
yeah,
you've taken the time to put yourself out there,
right,
right? And you've
yeah,
actually pushed yourself to actually share something, and
yeah,
then it's not met with understanding or empathy. That can be
yeah.
really, really difficult.
And I think that's why it's so important when you talked about like having a support system, and it may be a counselor and it may be one
Friend.
friend, one
Mm-hmm.
friend, it may not, it doesn't have to be this major support system,
Right.
but just kind of having that, that can even be, as people are saying, what can I do? I think part of what we can do is be proactive in creating that support system, getting
Mm-hmm.
getting someone in place so that when we're grieving, when we're facing that, when we're feeling the depth of the emotions, um, we have support in which to do that. Because I think often, from CS, we don't feel the emotions because we don't really know what to, when we start feeling those extreme emotions, we kind of
Mm-hmm.
shut down because we don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Because they're
Um,
uncomfortable. Yeah.
it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
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 So
And that's part
that,
of what makes those support group. I keep interrupting you,
yeah,
sorry,
no,
Katie.
no, go ahead.
But
Yeah.
that's part of what makes those support groups that you guys do so important,
Yeah.
because Christian Science is not I mean, the community of people coming out of Christian Science, it's not like you're going to have big groups of people in one location. So even being able to
Right.
do those virtually, I think
Hmm.
that's a really, really sweet space to be able
Yeah.
to be around other people who get it, who
Yeah.
know, and who've maybe walked through it.
And I think, yeah, I think you're right. And I think it also helps with that acknowledging piece where you start to see, oh, yes, that I was affected by CS negatively in that way. So I need to grieve that. It's sometimes we can kind of deny those pieces, or we can forget things. We can hold on to the good. And there were good things. So we don't want to just
Mhm.
say everything was bad, but it's hard then to process and recover if we haven't faced the difficulties as well.
Yeah.
Um, this question continued. It says, I chose CS as an adult, so I'm angry with myself.
Mm.
I am journaling, but do you have any other suggestions?
The thing that comes to mind with that is to think through what was actually the core behind why you chose CS. What was it that attracted you to it? Because sometimes understanding that core need or desire can be helpful in understanding, okay, it did meet something. It was on the whole not the best option, but it did meet something I needed. It had community, or it had ways of coping with hard things, or ways of making it feel like I was still in control, right? Like that I had ways of being able to control something. Just really understanding that core behind what brings you to Christian, or what brought you to Christian Science. And I think that's something specific to you choosing it as an adult, which is a little bit different than people growing up in it. But
Right.
that might be helpful to understand, like
Mhm.
where where your needs were met through it, even if just for a time, where your needs were met through it, because that is the underlying core that you were trying to get met, right? And I think when we can understand that, we can actually go in and say, are there other ways that I can get that core met? Um,
Mm.
because they
Right.
promised you something that they couldn't fulfill, they couldn't
Right.
make a return on.
Yeah, the desire was good. It just wasn't
Yeah,
being met in a way that's gonna lead
yeah,
to life, right?
right,
Yeah, yeah.
right.
So, yeah. Well, and that's interesting, even just thinking about that anger piece, because you did just such a great webinar a couple months ago on facing your anger. And then now, part of grief is anger. How do you know if you're angry out of a grief response, or if you're angry
Yeah.
because of injustice, or maybe there's overlap? I don't know.
Mhm.
What
Well,
is
there
that?
is overlap, and that's what part of what makes it so tricky,
Mm,
is there is overlap, but So if you go back to that roles thing, and this is what I think is the most helpful, if you can go back to the roles and say, okay, grief or anger is when there's a real or perceived injustice, and that anger gives us the motivation towards correcting it. The thing that's helpful about that is when you start to name what that injustice is, you'll start to know whether it's a current and active injustice or if that's a historical loss, right? So if you can put to words what the injustice is or was, then you can say, oh, is this something that I'm actively angry about in the present, or is it something I'm grieving in a more like over time sort of sense? And I think that is helpful. That is the helpful part. So anger, whether it comes up in grief or it kind of stands alone, is almost always about injustice. And if we can name that, we can start to put those pieces together in a way I think is really helpful and productive for moving through it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in my mind, these pieces are coming together of what you're talking about and kind of maybe answering the question, people keep saying, what can I do? What can I do? And I think that's what we want is we want to be better, right? We want to feel, we want to be grieved and be done with it, be happy, be
We all
perfect.
do.
Uh, and,
Mhm.
and so what I see you saying is kind of like unpacking it, untangling the pieces. And I think what's difficult about that is that it's pretty painful when we're talking about grieving Christian Science. So maybe an example would be if someone in our life died, and maybe we didn't have a great relationship with them.
Mm.
Maybe it was an abusive relationship or a neglectful relationship, and then they died. That would be complicated. That would be a complicated grieving process. Maybe there were some good things, but there also were difficult things. And I think that's a lot of what our experience of grieving Christian Science can look like too. And so it's hard to like want to honor or memorialize that.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and yet that's often a part of grieving. So
Yeah.
how do you do that when it's complicated?
It's a great question. And I know I typically, when we get to that point of complicated grief where there are so many different layers, I say that there's no one size fits all, right?
Yeah.
So I would recommend working with somebody on that one. Or even just, having a good friend or support system where you're kind of processing through that. But somebody who's familiar with grief and who has been through it before, when you're talking about doing a puzzle, you want people who are working on the puzzle with you who are really good at puzzles, right? You don't want little kids coming in, right? We want like adults who are like, I love puzzles, this is great. But I mean, you might sit down to it and think you're coming up against a 300-piece puzzle, and it's actually 1,000 and like, or 1,000,000-piece puzzle, and you're like, I don't even know where to start with this.
Yeah.
Well, that's when you call in the people who are really good at puzzles and you say, where do I start with a 1,000,000-piece puzzle? And then how do I get going with it? And hopefully they can help break it down into smaller tasks.
Yeah.
And that's where I would say, like, you don't have to do it all the time, right? It's not a 24/7 project. It is
Hmm.
something that you can kind of come and go. And as you're noticing it's impacting you, spend some time on the puzzle. And as
Yeah.
you're kind of experiencing some relief, enjoy the relief.
Mm.
That it's really okay to sit with both, and to let that cycle through.
Yeah. And there we go again, little pieces and
Mhm.
being mindful of your body and your emotions and taking breaks, all these things that um, we don't think about as ex-Christian Zionists. These all were not things that we were taught. Realizing that we even have a bandwidth probably for our grief, that we can probably
Mhm.
do only so much work at a time,
Yeah.
and then take a break and then keep going.
Yeah.
That's an important piece. And I think for some of us, it's hard to even get started. I know some people say like, what if I can't cry? Some people just can't. Um, it's hard for them to even begin the process of um, feeling the weight of the sadness.
Mhm. Sadness it's a tricky one because a lot of people associate that with crying, but that's not the only way to express sadness.
Hmm.
So if you're not a crier, that's okay too, right? Like, um, I really believe that when we're doing grief work, there are no shoulds. There are no, you have to do it this way, or it has to look like
Yeah.
that way. Like we have these expectations on grief, and then we almost have to grieve that we're not grieving the right way, right? And so it can get, again, we're adding more and more layers then on top of the grief.
Hmm.
So I think just as much as we can practice self-acceptance and just kindness to ourselves and what we're going through, the better. And you might cry, you might not cry. Yawning is another way to sort of offload some of that nervous system energy. Yawning, crying, laughing, all of those are like natural ways to, to kind of activate that nervous system. So, you might find that for you, crying is not the main way, right?
Yeah.
But just
That's really helpful, Gina. And I think what's doubly hard for us is that we weren't necessarily raised in a community that modeled grieving. For many of us, we didn't even go to funerals. There weren't funerals when people died. When there were losses, often it was denied. In God's perfect world, this didn't happen. And so it's not like we were raised being shaped by a community that grieved.
Right.
So it's good for us to find people in our community, if you're in a church community, find someone who is good at grieving, just like you said, who's good at putting puzzles together.
Yeah.
Because we can even have people around us who say, "Well, you left. Aren't you happy? It's over now. What's the problem?"
Yeah. And I find too, like Christian Science is off to one extreme, but Americans in general, we're not great at grieving either. We don't often slow down and take the time that we need to grieve. This is something you might actually find helpful if you have a lot of cross-cultural relationships. So I know we spent a lot of time in Africa, and in African culture, they grieve for a month straight, or they'll sit and gather and share food together. And there's just a slowing down of life that happens in African culture around death specifically. That's what I'm thinking about, grief.
Yeah.
But it might be helpful to surround yourself with people from different cultures too, right? There might be different strengths even beyond American culture that we might be able to tap into, just being part of a multicultural world, international community, right?
Yeah.
So that might be something else to look for, is different cultures that grieve better, or people who have been in cultures that grieve better, or give more time for that, space for that grief process.
That's a good suggestion. Are there any other resources that you'd recommend, Gina,
Anything by
for
Grief
next
Watch.
steps?
That's the one I
Okay.
really, really love. I'm also going to always plug this book. I love this book, Tear Soup. It's seriously one of my favorites. I feel like it's such a good starting point for just having language to talk about it. I put it in the presentation, that page about the cookbooks and the pots. Like that really is genuinely just so helpful when you think about, where do I start? Like, how do I pick a cookbook? How do I pick a pot? Right? Just giving you something to focus on. You don't have to worry about the whole soup right now. Just pick a pot, right? How much, where does this fall for you right now? And and giving yourself some concrete ways to think. So metaphors are really helpful in respect to that, because it gives you some pictures to connect with thoughts and feelings that can be like nebulous, right? So it's giving yourself a way to switch back and forth between the different hemispheres and layers of your brain. So pictures happen more on the right side of your brain, and words and logic happen more on the left. And so being able to integrate those and then integrate among those layers, like we talked about, is just a really helpful way to get started. So.
Yeah. And again, going back to like, where do you feel things? Probably, whatever memory comes to mind when you think about grief now is probably what, would be good to start grieving first, or interacting with first. Like, there's not like you have to think about one piece, there's no one right way to grieve or order for grieving this loss.
There's no shoulds.
Yeah. And I think it's just good for us too to realize that this is just really new for most former CSers. Grieving is really new because, even with anger, we expressed anger, it just was shameful. But
Right.
I think a lot of us, grief just really, I mean, it was not, I'm not even sure how much grief we
Mm.
experienced, unless
Right.
there was a major tragedy,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
because there
So
was
even
such
naming that.
denial. Yeah, there was such denial of anything being wrong that you really wouldn't process. So it just seems to me like anything we can do to be around, just going to funerals or
Yeah.
watching sad movies or
Hmm.
someone said, I feel like I'm crying inside, but it's hard to actually cry. Well, maybe,
Mm.
watching sad movies or something just to kind
Yeah.
of see something modeled for us.
Yeah.
Um,
Or to have some resonance with that emotional expression, right? So like
yeah,
another idea is like I often, if I feel like I need to cry and it's not happening, I feel a lot of tension in my back usually when I'm sad, and so I often will take a really hot shower, and that sometimes helps like stir up that feeling of sadness or tears. And so like the shower is my favorite place to cry, which is such a weird thing to say, but like I
yeah,
think you figure out what works for you, right? So
mm,
maybe it's Hallmark movies. I mean, honestly, Hallmark movies make people
yeah,
cry. So like tap into
yeah,
whatever you might cry
yeah,
at, and then see if you can connect that feeling in with what you're experiencing.
yeah,
Um, and be really kind to yourself in the
yeah.
process.
Be really kind.
I think that's the biggest
Hmm.
thing is like you're not
Yeah,
doing it wrong if you're doing it, right?
yeah,
You're
right.
doing enough,
Yeah.
right? And then it's enough for that day. And
Mm,
and great job, right? Because if you pulled one string out of that ball of yarn, you're doing it. You're
yeah,
grieving and you're doing
yeah,
something in that process. And so not
yeah.
feeling like you have to do it all or completely or the whole
Hmm.
thing all at
Yeah,
once. But
yeah.
with
Well,
that,
even taking the step of watching this webinar and even
yeah.
considering this today is a huge step, for a lot of us, just to kind of even just name that there is something to grieve and that it's something that we might experience at some point, even if
Yeah.
we're not quite ready to go there yet.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think I would just really encourage people to go back to this presentation and yeah, take pictures of the slides, really kind of sit
Mhm.
in different pieces because this is really new, for the former CS process. Someone said they asked a CS practitioner friend how I might approach grieving the death of my dad and mom, and he responded, "Why would you want to do that? Um, why would you
Oh,
want to do that?" And I think that just really captures, often what we faced in Christian Science. It was like, why
yeah.
would you even do that?
Yeah.
Because there's no death. And
Yeah.
so just realizing, yeah, step by step, there's a lot of, I feel like a lot of CS, put ice around our hearts, just not to feel, and honor just, the pain of loss, of very real loss of things, that we need to um, start melting.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing, but it can also be painful. So just taking it step by step is really important, and not doing it alone. Going to counseling, I think, is so helpful, and joining a support group. And
Mhm.
we have, Get Wise support groups where you can meet with other former Christian Scientists and just share stories and learn some really helpful information. We have new groups starting up, so we invite you to consider joining one of our groups. If this has been helpful, that's a great next step.
Mhm.
Um, and Also, if you are interested, we have another event coming up in a couple weeks on the 25th, which is going to be looking at grief in Scripture, because often, in Christian Science, we were taught there's no problems, and yet Scripture is full of lament and grieving. And so we're going to be, looking at that piece. So if you're interested in that, we'd love to invite you to join us for that event. And wow, Gina, this has just been really helpful. Thank you so much for,
You're so
just
welcome.
being here. And
Thanks for the conversation. And
yeah,
yeah.
oh, it's really great. Yeah, it's just really helpful. And I just, I just want to encourage everyone to really listen to Gina that this is, step-by-step process. We don't have to do it all at once. And this is really new, so be kind to yourself. Um, I also want to thank Jack, who's our technical director. Thanks for making this possible today. Thanks for everyone who came and just great questions and comments. It's really meaningful to yeah, just have you speak into this, and I mean even just to kind of grieve together by sharing just these painful memories and sharing just even just some of the ways we've been hurt. There's something just meaningful that you would share that with us. That's it's beautiful to walk together, and that's our goal here. So I also want to thank our financial supporters who help make webinars like these possible, and we invite you to support the Get Wise project through the Fellowship of Former Christian Scientists. And yeah, we just thank you for being here today and hope you can join us next time. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much. Bye.